There were all these camera crews around Snug Harbor. Snug Harbor is 1 block away. So I pull over and I said to a cameraman, what's going on? He says, well, there was a murder in room 404. That was my inkling there that something bad had happened, that Lois was involved in it. That night, we turned on the news and we watched every segment of the news, flipping from channel to channel to find out what had gone on.
Deputies found a body inside a room in the Marina Village at Snug Harbor.
Authorities began looking for 56-year-old Lois Reese.
Wanted for murder in 2 states.
One of them, her own look-alike.
She looked like someone's grandmother. The kind who wore lavender cardigans and orthopedic shoes. The kind who smiled softly through thick glasses, humming while she stirred sugar into tea. She offered cookies, chocolate chip, still warm. Told bedtime stories to the forgotten, the frail, the unwanted. Her home was a sanctuary, or so it seemed. The curtains fluttered with the breeze. The furniture was second-hand, but spotless. A porcelain angel sat on every shelf. And out back, behind the rose bushes, she kept a garden. Roses redder than blood. Lavender as thick as smoke. But the soil there. The soil was heavy. You see, people came to her when no one else would take them. Elderly men who'd outlived their families. Disabled tenants with nowhere to go. Veterans. Addicts. People collecting Social Security checks. She welcomed them. Gave them beds. Promised they'd be safe. Then they vanished. One by one, gone. And no one asked questions. Until a parole officer came looking for a man who never should have disappeared. What they found behind her house wasn't just bones. It was a truth so cold, so calculated, it made even seasoned detectives sick. Because when they knocked on her door, she smiled. Offered them tea. And said, "I don't know what you're talking about. But would you like some cookies?" She didn't panic. She didn't run. And when the bodies were pulled from the dirt, layer after layer, she never apologized. Not once. In fact, she said she was helping them. And when asked why, she just smiled again. And whispered, "You trust me, don't you?" In the heart of Sacramento, just blocks from bustling downtown and state government buildings, there stood an old Victorian house, weathered, soft blue, covered in ivy. A charming relic of the past. Inside, an elderly woman in a pressed dress served tea, told sweet stories, and opened her home to those no one else would. Her name was Dorothea Puente. Her guests were the forgotten. Men fresh out of prison. Elderly women too fragile for the streets. Schizophrenics abandoned by the system. Veterans no one called home. To the city, she was a saint. A quiet woman doing good work, housing the helpless. But over time, something felt wrong. Residents moved in, but didn't move out. Mail kept coming, checks kept arriving, but no one saw the recipients. One man went missing. Then another. And another. When questioned, she had answers. He left for Mexico. She found a job up north. He didn't like the rules. But the stories changed. Names were misspelled. Social Security checks kept being cashed. And beneath the blooming roses in her backyard was a different kind of garden. When authorities finally dug through the roots, they unearthed not 1, not 2, but 7 bodies. Men and women, stuffed in trash bags, rotting in shallow graves beneath freshly planted flowers. Some were disabled. Others had mental illness. A few had no family at all. They had been erased, not just from the city, but from memory. And through it all, she didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She didn't deny. In fact, she was annoyed. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said. But was she just a greedy fraud? Or something colder? Something that saw vulnerability as opportunity. And human beings, as disposable. Long before she became the infamous Granny Killer. Long before they found bones beneath her flower beds. Dorothea Helen Gray was just another little girl, born in a world that didn't want her. She came into the world in Redlands, California, in 1929, the daughter of a troubled family. Her father, a cotton picker, died of tuberculosis when Dorothea was just 8. Her mother, an alcoholic sex worker, died in a car crash a year later. By the time Dorothea turned 10, she was an orphan. Shuffled between foster homes and state institutions, places meant to protect her, but where cruelty often wore a badge or a Bible. And from that very young age, she learned one thing. If no one protects you, you protect yourself. And if no one sees you, then you can become anyone. She started small, fabricating family histories, changing her name. Claiming at different points to be Muslim, Jewish, Native American, even a survivor of Nazi Germany. The truth was always fluid. But her appearance, her soft voice, her fragile figure, her grandmotherly charm, never changed. And that's what people remembered. In the 1950s, she was married, several times. Each relationship more unstable than the last. One ended in suicide. Another in abandonment. She had children. But gave them away. By the time she was in her 40s, Dorothea had reinvented herself dozens of times. In court records, she was known as a thief. A forger. A woman who ran illegal boarding houses and brothels under false names. But to the community, she was nice. Quiet. She baked for neighbors. Went to church. Donated food to the homeless. Her house, at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, was always filled with people. A sanctuary, they said. But they didn't know about the parole violations. Or the jail stints for check fraud. Or the fact that she once drugged and robbed an elderly man in a bar. She'd already been in prison twice before she was 50. Yet still, they saw her as harmless. Sweet. Harmless. Nurturing. Maybe that was the most dangerous lie of all. They came to Dorothea's house for safety. For many, 1426 F Street was a last refuge, the place you ended up when nowhere else would take you. That's what brought Alberto Montoya to her door. He was 51 years old, developmentally disabled, and had been recently released from a mental health facility. A social worker placed him there. Dorothea smiled, opened her door, and welcomed him with tea. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll take care of him." And for a while, it seemed she did. Alberto was quiet, gentle. He liked to sit in the garden. The neighbors saw him. The postman waved to him. But then, without a sound, he vanished. No goodbye. No bags. Just, gone. And yet, his checks were still being cashed. His social security was still being collected, by Dorothea. When his social worker asked about him, Dorothea was calm. "Oh, he had to visit family down south," she said. Another time, he moved in with a friend near Riverside. She always had a story. Always gentle. Always believable. But months passed. And there was no sign of Alberto. The social worker grew suspicious and called the police. When officers arrived at the boarding house, Dorothea met them at the door, wearing an apron and offering cookies. come in," she said. "I'd never hurt anyone." They looked around. The place was clean. The other tenants, many with mental illness or disabilities, were calm. One said they hadn't seen Alberto in a while. But that was it. Nothing looked out of place. And so the police left. The official record notes, no evidence of foul play. But under the rose bushes, beneath layers of manicured soil, something terrible was beginning to fester. Dorothea wasn't just cashing checks. She was slowly, methodically, removing the people attached to them. And no one, not the police, not the state, was stopping her. It didn't happen all at once. In fact, that's what made it work so well. One tenant, then another, quietly, almost politely, disappeared. No screams. No blood. Just absence. At first, no one questioned it. People came and went from boarding houses all the time, especially the forgotten ones, old men and women with no close family, living off modest pensions or disability checks. But there were whispers. Neighbors began to notice the strange silences. A woman on the block remembered. "I used to hear him coughing at night." Then, nothing. When relatives did write, they received letters back, typed neatly on old, yellowing paper. "Dear sister, I've moved up north. I'm doing fine. No need to visit." Signed in shaky, almost childlike handwriting. But there was something off. The postmarks were local. The names spelled wrong. One daughter noticed the letter was signed Bobby, but her father always signed as Rob. A small detail. A chilling one. Yet when anyone asked Dorothea Puente, she smiled and shrugged. They got a new job. Moved out. You know how it is. She always had an explanation. And she delivered it like a grandmother giving you a cookie. Sweet. Sincere. Unbothered. But the pattern had already begun. Tenant leaves. Rent keeps coming. Social security checks keep arriving. No one sees the tenant again. There were at least 6 people who simply vanished between 1985 and 1988. None of them filed a change of address. None of them ever made contact with family again. But to the outside world, they were just names that faded from a list. Another case of transient souls moving on. A neighbor would later say, "It started feeling wrong. But I couldn't prove anything. She was just this sweet old lady baking pies and taking care of sick people." You don't think someone like that would lie, let alone kill. For years, no one asked the hard questions. Dorothea Puente was, to all appearances, a caring old woman, a good Samaritan who opened her doors to the homeless, the mentally ill, and the elderly. But the cracks in the illusion were starting to show. It began with a missing persons report, one that didn't go away. Bert Montoya was a 51-year-old man with developmental disabilities. He couldn't read or write and had lived in Puente's boarding house for years. Social workers had kept tabs on him, and for the most part, Bert seemed safe. But then, suddenly, he vanished. When the social worker in charge of Bert's case asked where he was, Dorothea gave her usual response. He went to live with family. But the social worker knew, Bert had no family. She filed a missing persons report. Enter Detective John Cabrera of the Sacramento Police Department. Unlike others, Cabrera wasn't soothed by Dorothea's grandmotherly act. He started digging. And what he found disturbed him. The boarding house had a string of residents who were unaccounted for. None had a known forwarding address. None had picked up their medications. Yet their social security checks were still being cashed, often signed over to Dorothea. Cabrera requested to speak with Dorothea, and she agreed, calm and pleasant. She wore thick glasses, her gray hair pulled back neatly, and served cookies with tea. But her stories were inconsistent. Dates didn't align. Some victims had supposedly left town before their last checks were cashed. Others were said to have moved out, but no taxi records, no witnesses, and no farewells. Cabrera would later recall. She looked like your grandma. But the way she answered questions, it was too rehearsed. Like she'd done it 100 times. Then came a cold, unforgettable quote. Something she said with a casual shrug when asked about her former tenants. On-screen quote appears in white type over a black background. People get old. They die. That's life. Dorothea Puente. The investigation was now in full swing. Neighbors were re-interviewed. Patterns reanalyzed. A corkboard in Cabrera's office began to fill, photographs of missing people connected by red string, dates written in fading ink, locations plotted and cross-checked. And the more they dug, the more the house on F Street began to resemble a tomb. November 11, 1988. The air in Sacramento was cool and still. A thin fog hugged the ground as investigators gathered outside 1426 F Street, Dorothea Puente's prim Victorian boarding house. From the sidewalk, nothing seemed out of place. The paint on the wooden siding was faded, but the front yard was neat. The rose bushes were blooming. And the woman who greeted detectives at the door. Calm. Smiling. Unbothered. She poured coffee. She offered pastries. But behind that warm hospitality was a dark secret buried just beneath the soil. Detective John Cabrera, now certain that something horrific had happened to Bert Montoya, had secured a search warrant. The grounds of the house, especially the backyard, were to be excavated. Puente sat silently as the officers stepped out back. Then came the sound that would change everything, a single shovel slicing into damp earth. SFX, rustle of a plastic tarp. Shovel thud. Low hum of a police radio. At first, it was just dirt. Roots. Old trash. But then the smell. Acrid. Heavy. Decay. And then, something solid. Cloth. Bone. A decomposed foot in a decaying sock, wrapped in a layer of plastic. The search halted. Silence fell. Police radio crackled to life. SFX, police radio static. Voice, we've got something. The team froze. More officers were called. Forensics rolled in. A perimeter was secured. Neighbors peered from behind curtains as word spread like wildfire. There was a body in Dorothea Puente's backyard. By nightfall, they had unearthed the full remains of an adult male. Later, it would be confirmed, the body was Bert Montoya. But the nightmare was only beginning. Cabrera believed this was not an isolated case. He ordered the yard searched in its entirety. With every foot of ground they turned, the horror deepened. Body 2. Body 3. Body 4. Over the course of several days, 7 bodies would be exhumed. All were tenants. All were presumed dead from drug overdoses or natural causes, on paper. But here they were. Wrapped in bed sheets. Bound in duct tape. Decomposing under rose bushes and flower beds. Some were buried so shallow, roots had grown around them. The press descended like vultures. Cameras captured men in white forensic suits carrying out body bags, one after another. Locals watched in disbelief. How could this tiny old woman, who wore knitted cardigans and brought casseroles to church, be behind something so monstrous? But the evidence was undeniable. Beneath the rose bushes, she had planted death. The sun hadn't even set on the first day of digging when the headlines hit. Bodies found at Sacramento boarding house. Murder in the garden. Sweet landlady or serial killer? By the following morning, it was front-page news from coast to coast. But the phrase that gripped the nation the most? The granny killer. It was almost too surreal to believe. She wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in dark alleys. She was a 59-year-old woman with puffed silver hair, thick glasses, and orthopedic shoes. She wore floral blouses. She volunteered at charity drives. She cooked meals for the homeless. She looked like someone's grandma, because she was. But Dorothea Puente was no ordinary grandmother. She was now the centerpiece of a growing national horror story. For law enforcement, this was more than just a local case. It became a national reckoning. The media frenzy was relentless. Each press conference brought more confusion than clarity. And through it all, Puente remained eerily composed. She offered no apologies. No signs of remorse. When asked by a reporter why the bodies were in her backyard, she calmly replied, "I used to be a very good person." Then she smiled. What America saw was impossible to forget. A killer hiding in plain sight. A woman who fed the hungry, then fed their remains to the earth. And as the media storm intensified, one question remained. Where was Dorothea Puente now? Because by the time authorities uncovered the seventh body, she was already gone. As investigators unearthed bone after bone from the backyard of 1426 F Street, one might assume the killer was already in custody. But they weren't. Not even close. Because Dorothea Puente, the granny killer, wasn't pacing in a holding cell. She wasn't in the back of a patrol car. She was sitting quietly in a nearby motel room, watching news coverage of her own crimes. With a drink in her hand. When the search warrant was first issued, Dorothea had been cooperative, charming, even. She offered detectives coffee. She smiled. She acted confused. But never panicked. And when she asked the lead officer if she could run down the street to buy a cup of coffee, they, thinking she was a harmless, elderly woman, let her go. She walked out the front door. And disappeared. The police didn't realize what had happened until hours later. By then, Puente had already hopped in a taxi, withdrawn money from an ATM, and vanished into the chaos of downtown Los Angeles. She checked into the Royal Viking Motel under an alias. She dyed her hair. And she waited. In her room, she flipped through newspapers that called her a monster. She listened to the news say she was armed and dangerous. She watched reporters replay her mugshot again and again. And she smiled. The revelation that she'd slipped away right under the police's noses caused outrage. How do you let a serial killer walk free? How does someone with 7 bodies in her backyard just disappear? The manhunt went national. Her photo was posted in bus terminals, on street corners, and broadcast on every major network. The FBI was called in. Tips poured in from all over the country. But for 5 full days, Dorothea Puente was a ghost. Then, on day 6, a miracle. An elderly man in a Los Angeles bar struck up a conversation with a woman who introduced herself as Donna Johansson. She was sweet. She said she'd just gotten out of an abusive marriage. She was looking for a fresh start. But something felt off. Too rehearsed. Too polished. The man recognized her face from the evening news and quietly called the police from a payphone. For 6 days, America's most wanted killer blended into society with the ease of someone who'd done it before. And maybe that was the scariest part of all. She didn't run because she was afraid. She ran because she could. And the world finally understood. Dorothea Puente wasn't a confused old woman. She was a predator. And for nearly a week, she had the entire nation under her spell, again. In March 1993, over 3 years after the first bones were dug from beneath the rose bushes, Dorothea Puente finally stood trial. She was 64 years old, frail, hunched over in a soft pink cardigan. To the untrained eye, she looked more like a church volunteer than a serial killer. But the courtroom would soon learn, behind the shawl and gentle voice was a mind cold enough to drug, kill, and bury people for profit, without a flicker of remorse. The prosecution's case was chilling, and detailed. Over 6 months, they laid out a pattern of deception. Tenants were selected for being weak, elderly, or vulnerable. Puente forged government checks. Victims were drugged with Dalmane and Halcion, sleep medications in fatal doses. Once dead, she buried them quietly in the garden. And told neighbors they had moved away. The motive? Plain and simple, greed. By the time she was arrested, Puente had collected over $87,000 in stolen benefits from her victims, while their families received fake letters claiming they were alive and well. But Puente didn't plead guilty. Far from it. Her defense attorney painted her as a misunderstood caregiver. A kind old woman who'd taken in the sick and elderly out of the kindness of her heart. And if those people died in her care, that was just old age. Natural causes. Not murder. The courtroom was divided. The jury watched her closely. Was she a sweet old woman being scapegoated? Or was this just the final act of a long con? The trial was over. The headlines had faded. Cooking with a serial killer featured recipes she once served to her tenants. Tuna casserole, pork chops with spiced apples, banana pudding. All from the same kitchen where the victims had their last meals. She signed her introduction with grace and sincerity. I do not kill. I have never killed. I believe in helping people. And people believed her. Some did. She received fan mail. One man proposed marriage. Another asked for her autograph. She became the Granny Killer, a name whispered with equal parts horror and fascination. But not everyone was captivated. For families of the dead, her fame was a wound that never healed. Ruth Monroe's daughter said she couldn't walk past a rose bush without crying. Bert Montoya's caseworker left social work entirely. There were whispers of more victims, people whose remains were never found. A rumor that Puente may have killed up to 15. But without evidence, it remained speculation. And Dorothea never confessed. She died in prison on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82. Natural causes. She went quietly, the same way many of her victims did. In the years since, the case has lived on, through books, podcasts, documentaries. A house once filled with the dead is now a macabre tourist stop. Visitors pose outside the White Victorian at 1426 F Street, unaware they're standing on a graveyard hidden by geraniums and charm. And the story continues to haunt us, not because of what she did, but because of who she was. She wasn't a monster hiding in shadows. She wasn't a wild-eyed killer. She was soft-spoken. She offered cookies. She cared for the sick. She looked like your grandmother. And she used that to kill. She offered warmth. A home. A hot plate of food. She promised safety to the people the world forgot. And one by one, she buried them. Dorothea Puente wasn't some stranger lurking in alleyways. She was a caregiver. A grandmother. She looked you in the eye and told you she loved you. Then she signed your social security check. And poured you another drink. What makes her story unforgettable isn't just the horror. It's the betrayal. She preyed on trust. She preyed on kindness. She knew exactly who would disappear without noise. Her home wasn't just a house of death. It was a trap wrapped in wallpaper and tea cookies. She died never admitting guilt. She left no apology. Only questions. How many did she really kill? How many more were never found? And the most chilling question of all. Would we have seen her coming? Or would we have had tea on the porch? And never woken up again? If this story left you stunned, you're not alone. Because evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks like a smile and an open door. Subscribe for more chilling stories like this. Comment below. Would you have seen through Dorothea Puente? And remember, monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, they bake banana bread.